Well, good evening, everybody. Hopefully you can see me speaking. It's Mike Shockett. We are so pleased to have all of you join us tonight for this special dialogue on Ukraine. We're expecting over about 250 people, so we're still not quite there yet, but we're going to get started just because of time. Just a couple of words of logistics. Please stay muted during the entire Zoom meeting. If you have a question that you'd like Barbara, our moderator, to ask, please put it in the chat, but we're not going to be able to promise you that we'll be able to answer all the questions. And I will try to group questions that are on the same subject. So we'll try and get to the different subjects if we can. Also, you may want to put your Zoom screen on speaker view as opposed to gallery view. If you don't know how to do that, it should be, if you're on a computer, in the upper right-hand corner, there's a view button. Click on that, put it on speaker view, and then what you'll see are 7 of us on the screen, our moderator, Barbara, our panelists, and the rabbis and myself. I'm looking for, okay, I see. So we have, we also are going to try and stay on time. We're hoping to end around 8 o'clock, give or take a few minutes. So we want to keep it to that. This is an amazing, amazing panel that we've put together here at Temple Shalom. I'm just, I feel so blessed, and I'm speaking for Rabbi Schwartzman and Rabbi Sachs as well, that we have in our congregation such incredible experts that can speak to a lot of the things that go on in this world. And so when we were thinking about putting together this panel to speak about Ukraine and especially what's going on in the Jewish community of Ukraine and the war in general, it was not hard at all to find the experts that are some of the foremost thinkers in international policy that are with us tonight. It's unbelievable, and everyone is a member of Temple Road of Shalom. How great is that? I remember growing up watching Fiddler on the Roof, and I remember that they talked about going to Kyiv, the big city in Kyiv, which now is, of course, is called Kyiv because it's the Ukrainian pronunciation, not the Russian pronunciation, which Kyiv is. But as all of you probably know, this area in Ukraine was home to as many as 2 million Jews before World War II. And some put estimates before this current war at a population of about 400,000 Jews. Many of us have ancestors that came from there that emigrated to the United States. I know for me, a lot of the Jewish music composers of music that we listen to and sing each and every Shabbat are Jews that came from Ukraine. It was a highly rich Jewish area. And so when we are seeing what's going on the news, and some of us are just so disheartened at what we're seeing, it's also a piece of who we are, our identity, that is being bombed too. And we're hoping that this panel helps all of you have a greater insight of what's going on there right now. I'm sure all of you are following the news and listening to the reporters that are on the ground there or in other areas in Poland and such. But here tonight, we're going to focus a little bit on the general picture, but really also on the Jewish picture as well. And at the end, we'll have a link on our website where you can reach out to different relief agencies to make donations or to get involved, if you will. So I'm going to turn this over to Barbara Stephenson, who is an ambassador retired from the State Department after many, many long years in foreign service, and really, as I'm hearing tonight, a teacher to other foreign service workers and ambassadors, someone who I got to travel to Israel with, who I've helped mentor in the Road of Chokhmah class recently, and who I enjoy having her be a part of life at Temple Road of Shalom. So Barbara, welcome. And thank you so much for being agreeing to moderate this. We are just so blessed to have you part of this. So I'm going to turn that over to you, Barbara. And just ask you to unmute.
Thank you so much, Mike. And a big thank you to all 257 members of our congregation who are spending their Sunday evening with this panel. One of the reasons I'm so proud to be part of Temple Road of Shalom. The other reason, as Mike said, is what a panel. And I have to say, I do not believe there's any congregation anywhere in the world that could have put together a panel with this kind of real experience living in Ukraine, working in Ukraine, making policy that affects the way this all unfolded, and still with contacts that they're in touch with to this day. We're going to go through Mitch, and then Nancy, and then Jim, and then Paul, each doing about 6 minutes. And then I'm hoping we have a time for a question on Babyn Yar. And then we will, about 7:35 to 7:40, pivot to taking your questions. So we're going to start off with the Jewish perspective, really putting that front and center. And there's nobody better to do that for us than Mitch Weiner, who lived in Ukraine for 4 years with the World Bank, doing a USAID project on pension reform, right, Mitch? In his,
that's right.
It was his idea to do this panel. And when he wrote in his bio, he described the years that he lived and worked in Kyiv as perhaps, quote, the greatest Jewish experience of my life. So I'm just going to turn it over to you. You have family from there. You met your wife there. Tell us about Jewish life. Make it real for us.
Okay. Thanks so much, Barbara. Welcome to everybody from the congregation, and thanks again to Cantor Shockett and everyone for organizing this. So, as mentioned, I'm a senior social security expert with the World Bank. I'm also the senior actuary of the World Bank, and I've spent 16 years of my life living outside the United States and working outside of the United States. And all of my children were raised for at least part of their lives overseas. And I've actually worked in, not only have I worked in Ukraine, but I've worked in 11 of the 15 republics of the former Soviet Union, though I spent more time in Ukraine than any of the others. I lived there almost 5 years. And I was fortunate enough to live there at a very good time for Ukraine, a very prosperous time for Ukraine, and a very good time for the Jewish community from 1998 to 2002. And I had the additional challenge of I was a single dad raising 2 children living overseas in Ukraine. So my kids were 9 and 11 at the time that we moved there. And as I'll tell you more about, they were bar and bat mitzvahed in Ukraine, and I was married to my current wife in Ukraine. So when I first arrived in Ukraine, President Kuchma was president of Ukraine, and he was instrumental in returning a great deal of Jewish property that had been seized following World War II and been seized during the Soviet era. And in particular, the Central Synagogue of Kyiv, which was a puppet theater for many, many years, was returned in a big ceremony that I attended. It was returned to the Jewish community. Today it's a Chabad synagogue. And so just to set the scene, there's when I was there and today, there's 3 synagogues in Kyiv. There's the Central Synagogue, which is Chabad. The rabbi is Rabbi Moshe Osman, who's from Russia. There's the Padil Synagogue, which is in the old Jewish quarter of Kyiv, down by the river, down by the Dnipro River. Rabbi Yaakov Bleich is there now. He's from the Karlin Stoliner Hasidic sect. And then there's Congregation HaTikva, which is the Progressive Synagogue, the Reformed Synagogue. When I first got there, there was an American rabbi there, Rabbi David Wilfond. And I met David Wilfond when he organized a trip to Pereyaslav for all of us to go see the birthplace of Shalom Aleichem, which is quite close to Kyiv. And we traveled by boat down the Dnipro River. to visit Pereyaslav. So he was the rabbi there for about the first year, and I actually didn't know Hatikva existed until I met him on this particular trip. And after that came Rabbi Alex Duchovny, who I've known for more than 20 years. I was there when he first came to Congregation Hatikva, and he's a Ukrainian rabbi, and he's still there to this day. And I'm more proud than I can tell you of Rabbi Alex for all the work that he's done in building Congregation Hatikva. And I really thought when I first got there, I thought he would stay for 5 years and leave. And he surprised me in a wonderful way by staying and committing himself to the Jewish community and building the Reform community in Kyiv. So unfortunately, in typical Jewish fashion, and it exists still to this day, the two Orthodox synagogues dislike each other, and both of them dislike the Reform synagogue. So it's, unfortunately, it's typical Judaism. And I remember when I first met Rabbi Blythe, I didn't know what sect he was from, and so I asked him, I said, "Are you Chabad?" And he looked at me and he was not joking. He said, "No, I'm Jewish." So, again, going back to the divisions we have with each other, but he also had a great sense of humor because my 9-year-old was sitting in services at the Orthodox synagogue. And of course, he had no interest in the service. So he would bring a Garfield cartoon book with him and he would sit there. And Rabbi Blythe were in the service one day for Shabbat. And Rabbi Blythe goes by and without missing a beat, he points to his prayer book and he says, "We're right here." And he points to a picture of Garfield and there's a big balloon over Garfield's head, which says, "I'm bored." And it's just comic timing. It was just perfect. The other thing that was really interesting is that religious revival in general was just starting in Ukraine when I lived there, and not just for Jews, but also for the Russian Orthodox, for the Muslim. All religions had been suppressed in the Soviet Union, not just the Jewish religion. And what was really interesting is, for all of us, our grandparents taught us, our traditions, and to our parents, and our parents taught us. But what I saw in Ukraine was exactly the opposite. Young kids were coming to the synagogue and learning their own religion, and then they were teaching their parents and bringing their parents to the synagogue. And so you saw it flowing up instead of flowing down. And it was one of the most interesting things that I saw there. So turning to Congregation Hatikva, we didn't have our own synagogue building when I first got there. We were at a place called Dom Aktor, which was the House of Actors. And actually, if you go back in history, I don't remember how many years, it actually used to be a synagogue at the time. My daughter, Jessica, was the first bar or bat mitzvah in the history of Congregation Hatikva. And then my son, Jeremy, was also bar mitzvah in Ukraine 2 years later. And on top of that, I had the privilege of serving on the board of Hatikva in its early years. And a number of the board members are still there, and I saw them very recently when I was back in Ukraine in 2018. And I was very pleased when I went back to see that Hatikva finally has its own synagogue. They have their own synagogue building because they were moving from place to place. And I found out after Dom Aktor, they were in many, many other places before they settled where they are now down in Podol. We also had an organization called the Jack Club there, which was an organization for American Jews and expat Jews and Ukrainian Jews to get together and celebrate holidays. There's a lady named Linda Bernstein from USAID who was president of that when I got there, but then she left Ukraine and I inherited the Jack Club. So I was president of the Jack Club for several years. And one of the coolest things we ever did is we got 2 US ambassadors to agree to let us hold Passover Seders in the ambassador's residence. So they gave us their kitchen staff, they gave us their china, they gave us their dining room, and they allowed us to have Seders there. I had the privilege of running the Seders all 3 years with two different ambassadors, neither of whom were Jewish. And unfortunately, it became kind of a political event once it was held at the ambassador's residence. So all the rabbis wanted to be invited. And so I ended up, really scary thing, I'm running a Seder there, and I had all 3 rabbis from Kyiv sitting there at my Seder because we started early and they were able to come early, and then they went off to run their own Seders. But it was really amazing. And I remember thinking, how is this even possible? That I'm living in Ukraine where the Jews, we spent my whole childhood trying to get Jews out of the former Soviet Union. How is it possible that I'm running a Seder openly in Kyiv? It just, to me, was absolutely amazing and impossible to be able to do that. And then I met my wife there, my current wife, and we were married there. We were married in a traditional Ukrainian wedding palace. So I had a very traditional wedding, and she and I will be celebrating our 20th wedding anniversary 1 month from today. And as was mentioned earlier, my family is from Ukraine on my mother's side, a town called Nemirov, which is in central Ukraine in Vinnytsia Oblast, a place where many, many Jews lived prior to World War II. They left much earlier, though. Our family left in 1905 to escape, again, persecution and pogroms. And I was able to visit Nemirov. Actually, one person on my staff of my project arranged it for me. We met the head of the Jewish community there. He told us stories about our family that we never knew. I was able to take my mom down there when she came for our wedding. And it was, there were statues and memorials that had names of family members on it that we didn't even know about. And we also thought that our entire family had escaped from Ukraine, but unfortunately we found out that wasn't true. There actually was a whole side of the family that unfortunately perished during the Holocaust. And, I still have relatives there. My wife's mother and sister still live in Crimea. Thank goodness they're safe, because the one place there isn't fighting is in Crimea. We have so many friends in Kyiv that are in grave danger. Some of them are still there participating on night watches every single night and living in shelters. Others are making their way out of the country. A lot of them don't know whether it's safer to leave or to stay. We're in contact with them day and night with what's going on. I'll stop there. I've probably gone over my time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mitch. And we're going to turn now to Nancy Pettit, Ambassador Pettit, who knows a thing or two about those dining rooms and all. May I remind everyone who's joined, you can go to speaker view by clicking on view in the upper right hand and go to speaker view. Then you'll be able to see the speaker. Nancy, you served not only as ambassador to Latvia, but as the press attache at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv from 2007 to 10. And you've got family roots in Ukraine, and you remain in active contact with members of Ukraine's Jewish community. What do you want to talk to TS? What do you want TRS congregants to know about Ukraine's Jewish community in this extraordinarily difficult situation that Ukrainians are facing?
Thanks, Barbara. And I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Jim and I have been members of Rodef Shalom for about 38 years. And I think we bring a unique perspective to the situation in Ukraine. Jim and I served 3 times in Moscow for a total of 8 years. We were there in the mid 80s, we were there in the 90s, and then we were there in the early 2000s. And I turned 30 years old, 40 years old, and 50 years old in Moscow. From Moscow, we moved to Kyiv. We were there from 2007 to 2010. And then I returned to the State Department, where I was the director for Western European Affairs. And then I went out to Latvia as the US ambassador. I also have strong family connections to Kyiv, to Ukraine. My father's side of the family is from a village called Korsun. When we were serving there, I did have an opportunity to go to Korsun and visit. But unfortunately, there was really nothing left. The synagogue had been destroyed. I met with the director of the Jewish community there. It was a tiny Jewish community. The synagogue had been destroyed, the cemetery had been destroyed, and there were no archival records of my family. My great grandma had a scar on her forehead, and family lore says that it was from a Cossack sword. And one of the reasons that the family left was due to pogroms. My connection to the Jewish community is to the Reform synagogue that Mitchell was talking about, Congregation Hatikva. My mother died when we were serving in Kyiv, and Jim and I went to the congregation every Friday night for a year so I could say Kaddish. During this year of mourning, I became very, very close to members of the small Hatikva community. I would describe this community as elderly mostly and not affluent. As Mitchell said, the congregation moved from one location to another. Sometimes we would go to services and they'd say, "Oh, no, the congregation now is in a different part of the city," and we'd have to find out where the new location was. The congregation did develop its own permanent home, and we stayed in touch with Rabbi Duchovny. And for the last week, he was in a basement in Kyiv with 50 other people. I'm happy to report tonight that he's in Moldova on his way to Bucharest, and then hopes to get a flight to Israel. And he told me that there are some members of the congregation with him as well. I know that everyone knows that President Zelensky is Jewish, but the reason he was elected president is because the Ukrainians were fed up with the amount of corruption in the country. This was a terrible, soul-destroying problem when we lived there. As Barbara said, I was press attache. The media was corrupt. Politicians would pay journalists to write about them, and they would pay journalists not to write about them. And the US government funded many media training programs to try to strengthen and support independent media in Ukraine. At this point, there are dozens and dozens of Jewish communities in the country that have been torn apart. And most will need to start from scratch when they have to put themselves back together again when this is all over. And World Jewry will need to assist them in the rebuilding of Jewish life in Ukraine. The refugee problem, as you know, is the largest mass movement of people towards the West since World War II. Experts estimate over 10 million Ukrainians, so about a quarter of the population is going to they'll become refugees. Many are going to Poland, but they are also going to Moldova, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia. Some are also going to the Baltics. And I want to add that Russians are also leaving Russia. Russian journalists in particular are now moving to the Baltics. These countries are not wealthy countries. They don't have the infrastructure to support these refugees, and they don't have the financial support that they need yet to support this very, very large group of refugees. This is an incredible humanitarian disaster, the likes of which we have not seen in our lifetimes. Members of the Jewish community are, of course, among those affected, and members of Temple Road of Shalom should start planning now on how we will assist. The US Congress could very well allow new refugee numbers for Ukraine. So it's possible that we will see Ukrainian Jewish refugees coming to our country. A portion of the Ukrainian Jewish community may end up in Israel, and wherever they are, they're going to need our support. So I think those are the extent of my comments for now, and I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That was so insightful. Now we have Ambassador Pettit #2, Jim, who was ambassador to Moldova, was Deputy Chief of Mission and Acting Ambassador in Kyiv from 2007 to 2010. Can you give us any insight, Jim, into the factors that may have led to the current crisis? What are some of the complexities emerging from Ukraine's relatively recent efforts to foster a unique cultural identity that may have led to this violent clash of two distinct but related cultures?
Thank you, Barbara, and good evening, everyone. It's been 12 years since I was in Ukraine, but that doesn't stop me from having lots of opinions on what led to this. We arrived in 2007. Bill Taylor was ambassador then, and some of you may recognize that name as a witness at Donald Trump's first impeachment trial, because lest we forget, that was about Ukraine. At that time, we now have a wonderful modern embassy building there, but at that time we were in a very old building in downtown Kyiv that had formerly been Communist Party headquarters. As a matter of fact, when we moved in, there was a huge bust of Lenin that to this day is still in the Embassy Marine House. So that's a little bit of interesting history. The work conditions were a little astir. I don't think that OSHA would have approved of the environment we were working in, but what we lacked in accommodations, we made up for in morale. It was a very interesting time to be in Ukraine. 2004, of course, was the Orange Revolution, which I missed, but that was a signal that the Ukrainians were sick of the old Soviet view of things and really wanted something that was a little more Ukrainian. Yushchenko came in, and also Tymoshenko as his prime minister. Tymoshenko, some of you may have seen, is the woman with the blonde braids. I mean, really looks like Mother Ukraine. Both of them very, very much wanting to create a Ukrainian national identity and a Ukrainian history, authentically Ukrainian, distinct from the Soviet/Russian culture that really permeated Ukraine at the time. They did it by advocating use of the Ukrainian language. Certainly the new generation, their education is largely received in Ukrainian. There still are some Russian language schools. What I discovered very early on is that in Ukraine, it's all about language, not necessarily ethnicity. An overwhelming majority of Ukrainians are ethnically Ukrainian, over 75%. Your ethnic Russians are only about 17%. But many, many ethnic Ukrainians do speak Russian as the predominant language. And as a matter of fact, and this may come as a surprise to some, Kyiv, when we were there 12 years ago, was a Russian-speaking city. As a matter of fact, my wife, poor Nancy, who took a year of Ukrainian, had trouble finding people to speak Ukrainian with. As a matter of fact, she tried to buy a Ukrainian newspaper from kiosk and was warned that the newspaper was in Ukrainian. So it needed some fixing, and it became a little political. And by the way, not unique to Ukraine. I was ambassador to Moldova. You've got the same issue with the Romanian language and the Russian language. I only touch upon it because while it may seem a somewhat minor issue to you, language, I would say, is the number one thing in terms of conflict between Russia and Ukraine. The Ukrainianization effort, I think we have to be sympathetic to it, but you also have to bear in mind that there was a Russification effort that existed for even pre-Soviet, for when Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire. While I was there, 2008, 2009, of course, there was a global economic crisis, but it hit the former Soviet Union particularly hard. The economy shrank about 15%. One New Year's Eve, the Ukrainians had been unable to pay for their gas supplies from Russia. And on New Year's Eve, and I had to leave a party to attend to this, the Russians turned off the gas. Not the first time, probably not the last time. But it shows you that the focus on Russia's supply of oil and gas, not only to Ukraine but to Europe in general, is a major factor in this conflict. In 2009, I was actually chargé d'affaires, which means acting mission director. Chargé d'affaires, for those of you who don't know, is French for "you're not the ambassador." And but I was in that position for about 8 months, and was able to talk to the highest levels of Ukrainian society there. It was a time of evolution in terms of fostering Ukrainian culture, and then the unthinkable happened, and in a popular election, Yanukovych, who had been thrown out during the Orange Revolution, was actually popularly elected. This is an astounding event because people would think, why would Yanukovych, who is clearly identified as pro-Russian, be elected? And it was simply because so many people were tired of the corruption and also the bad personal relationship between Tymoshenko and Yushchenko. It was a big tragedy for Ukraine. And we had a new ambassador come, John Teft. I went to all of his introductory meetings with Yanukovych's cabinet. And here's what I noticed, folks. Meetings that had been conducted in Ukrainian before were now all conducted in Russian. So this all happened long before there was any Russian invasion of Ukraine, long before what we're seeing now. So you already had this conflict between those who wanted to Ukrainianize Ukraine, those who wanted to Russify it, and then a very large number of people, particularly the older generation, who missed the Soviet Union. So we left in 2010, but 2014, we all remember there was Euromaidan, and that was after a rigged election. We're all familiar with that term, where Yanukovych had tried to claim the presidency and wanted to just steer Ukraine off of its EU trajectory. Ukraine had also, while I was there, been on a trajectory to join NATO as well, something that I'm sure they wish they had accelerated and been able to accomplish. Anyway, in general, a mess, and politically it's been complicated ever since. To understand the Russian view of Ukraine, and going back to language, it's important to note that the Russians basically consider Ukrainian as a peasant dialect. They don't consider it as a real language. They don't consider it as a real country. And I am going to try to run through this very quickly. And just to wrap it up, what you saw happen in Crimea and in the Donbass is also ultimately very much language oriented. These are Russian speaking areas. Crimea especially always considered itself very Russian. We would go down there, there'd be Russian flags flying and the whole thing. So I do feel I have to give a little Jewish spin here, Barbara. It'll just take me 10 seconds. Okay, here's my view of how Jews and the fact of Judaism's long presence in Ukraine can possibly help. And that is Jews as a bridge. Ukrainian Jews are largely Russian speaking. They themselves have had issues with some of the more traditional Ukrainian cultural manifestations, such as the Cossacks. And I think that they have a certain legitimacy both in Russia and in Ukraine that I think could help. And we're seeing it, for example, with the Israeli Prime Minister going up to Moscow a couple days ago, the Israeli Foreign Minister meeting with our Secretary of State soon. These are all things that show that maybe the Jews and Israel writ large could play a constructive role in resolving a conflict because they do have credibility with both countries. And I will stop on that.
Well, that was absolutely fascinating and tantalizing. Jim, we'll have to come back to this, Jews as Bridge. Wonderful. We would like to get Paul Shapiro to come on with us now. Paul is an expert in Jewish history in Eastern Europe. And one fun fact that he was the US representative, he represented the United States at the ceremony to launch a Holocaust Education Center at Babyn Yar. And he was with President Poroshenko and the mayor of Kyiv and others. And here's the other thing about Paul. You saw this in the invitation. He hosted President Zelensky in September of 2021 at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. So we've asked Paul to talk a little bit about that experience and what does it mean to all of us as Jews to see a president of a country under attack, a president who's Jewish, who's just emerged as a hero for our time. So Paul, over to you.
Thanks very much, Barbara, and thanks to everybody who has logged on and listened to us this evening. I want to take a crack at answering the question, what does it mean to have someone like President Zelensky as president of Ukraine, of a country in crisis? And I think I can offer 4 ways to look at it. One is just the man. He is really impressive. Of course, it takes intelligence to become a president of a country usually. It takes a degree of chutzpah, which is a trait of the Jewish people, let's say. And right now he's showing phenomenal courage. So I think for the Jewish people, seeing a figure like that in the place where he is doing the things that he's doing, well, it really is a reason to be proud. Second take on this, let me talk for a minute about his visit to the museum. Initially, when we were contacted by the Embassy of Ukraine in Washington, was to be a private visit of the president and his wife, accompanied by the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States. We woke up the day before the visit with 30 people in his party who had accompanied him to Washington, D.C. for clearly important political military discussions. So it included the Minister of Defense and the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Culture and the Minister of Economics, and you can go down the list, as well as the most senior staff in President Zelensky's office. And he insisted that they all come to the Holocaust Museum. Now, what can I say about that visit? Let me put it in perspective this way. Every Ukrainian president and prime minister who has come officially to Washington, D.C., and every Ukrainian ambassador since the museum has been open who has served in Washington, D.C., has come to the Holocaust Museum. I'll give that meaning by saying that the contrast with the Russian Federation is absolute. No Russian prime minister or cabinet official who's come to Washington on official business has come to our museum, and no Russian ambassador serving in Washington has come to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, in spite of multiple invitations to do it. So as you evaluate the forces that are at war today, just consider that as a kind of context. Third crack that I'll take at what does this mean is what it says about Ukraine. It's important to remember that Ukraine has a long tradition of anti-Semitic manifestations, and of course, long tradition of housing very large Jewish community. Ukraine was the heart of the Pale of Settlement in the Russian Empire. In the 17th century, you had Bogdan Khmelnytsky, and it's said that during his uprising, something like 30,000 Jews were killed. In the 1917-1921 period, during the Russian Civil War, and then a brief period of Ukrainian independence, pogroms and action by the two armies, the Red and White armies, left something like 100,000 Jews dead in Ukraine. In World War II, there were Ukrainian collaborators with the Nazis, not more than in other countries, a different form, but they were there. And then after World War II, you had 45 years of post-war official Soviet anti-Semitism. And yet, in that country, they elected overwhelmingly, 73% of the people who voted to elect and are now following a Jewish president. They're working on the creation of a Holocaust museum at Babyn Yar, a site of major catastrophe during World War II in Kyiv. There is a new program for teaching the Holocaust at the National University, at the Taras Shevchenko National University. So what does that mean for the Jewish world? To me, it's actually a very positive sign, because it's one of the few places today where you can see that it is possible to overcome anti-Semitic prejudice and for countries and societies to turn a corner in a more positive direction from a Jewish perspective. And that, of course, assumes that people there survive. Last point, and this is a more universal point. The election of President Zelensky and the role that he's playing is really only possible in an open democratic society. And that is what the Ukrainians are really aspiring for. A system that functions on the basis of equal justice under law. It's definitely not possible. We can see it in history. for such a situation, the election of a Jew to lead your country in societies that have strongman rule or people who believe that the law doesn't apply to them. You know, we read a lot about the Russian Jewish oligarchs. You know, anyone who thinks that those people are secure, that's a mistake. They exist with their wealth because they're tolerated and used by the strongman. And that can change just like that. So, final Jewish perspective, ultimately our best hope is democracy. And that's true even in a time when authoritarian kinds of tendencies are attracting some segments of the Jewish people in a different direction. I'll end there.
That was powerful. Thank you. And I'm going to ask Rabbi Schwartzman to bring all the panelists back on now, and we are going to start to answer some of the excellent questions that have come in. The first one is, what's your take on Prime Minister Naftali Bennett's 3-hour meeting yesterday with Putin? And I'm wondering, perhaps Nancy or Jim would want to offer their thoughts on that.
Well, I'd say, you know, Jim alluded to this a lot in his presentation when he said that it's possible that Israel could play a bridging or mediating role in this conflict. But in terms of the meeting, there's been actually very little substantive reporting on what happened. And I think we're waiting to find out what the details are. We know that the Israeli foreign minister is meeting in Riga tomorrow with Tony Blinken, our Secretary of State, and to brief him on what happened. And we know that the meeting was dedicated mostly to humanitarian concerns and opening up of corridors so that people can escape cities that are currently under siege. Hundreds of thousands of people now don't have access to gas, electricity, water, and the humanitarian aspects of this are dire. So I know it's my understanding that that was a large part of the conversation, trying to convince the Russians to stop shelling long enough to allow people to leave. And Jim, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, I do think that covers it. And like I say, I see this as an example of a somewhat unique and constructive role that Jews can play. Jewish communities in Ukraine, Jewish communities in Russia, they have a lot of contact. There's a lot of affinity with other republics of the former Soviet Union that gives, I think, Jews a certain credibility. They're not, I mean, don't get me wrong, Jews in Ukraine are loyal citizens of Ukraine. They believe in Ukraine, but it's been a complicated history, as we've heard. And I saw in Moldova, when I was ambassador, that the Jewish community in Moldova proper and the Russian-occupied Transnistrian portion of Moldova, those communities were very close, and they dealt with each other all the time, even though there's basically a Berlin Wall between the two parts of Moldova. The Jews play an interesting and unique role throughout Eastern Europe, but particularly in the former Soviet Union.
Thank you. The next question, not surprisingly, is about this remarkable flow of refugees that we see. And it's kind of, there's two prongs to it. And I'm thinking it's probably Mitch and Jim I'll turn to answer this. The first part is a simple, straightforward question. Are Ukrainians coming here? And then a question that is about the impact of refugee flows. In recent years, we've seen that when we've had big flows of refugees, it has sparked nationalism and, you know, Brexit and those kind of thinking, which led to these changes in politics. Do you see that happening again, or does it feel different this time? And who would like to start?
I'll start simply because I used to work in the Refugee Bureau at the State
Thought so.
Department. I was actually director of the Washington Processing Center in the in the mid 90s, which oversaw the Soviet refugee program, much of which was Jewish. I think that almost to a fault, we have seen that Europe has been very receptive to Ukrainian refugees in a way that they weren't so much with Syrian refugees. And you can draw your own conclusions from that. There's certainly a cultural linguistic affinity with Poland, for example, and Poland and Ukraine have always had, not always, sometimes they've had very bad relations, but they've had generally good relations. And the Poles love to visit Lviv because they think that's how Poland used to look. So I think people are pretty receptive. In terms of coming to the United States, we have rules. We have a quota, basically. We have a cap, a numerical cap on how many refugees can be brought in, and that requires congressional approval. I would suspect that Congress would be favorably disposed to increasing the number of Ukrainians, and that, of course, gives the whole panoply of benefits of resettlement and everything else that your average immigrant doesn't normally get. Refugees get special treatment for resettlement, but I'll defer to Mitch because he may have some personal insights.
Well, certainly the World Bank does a lot of work with resettlement of refugees as well. It's, one of the big areas that we operate in. I can't say that I'm particularly active in that area, but I can tell you what I know about what's going on with a lot of our friends and what I know about some of the neighboring countries. So as Jim mentioned, the Polish language and the Ukrainian language are very, very similar. When we used to take study tours from, when we'd take Ukrainians to study tours in Poland, we did not need a translator to speak from Ukrainian to Polish. Russian to Polish is a different animal altogether. So the Poles are generally very welcoming of the Ukrainians because they fit into their society very easily. They can understand the languages and everything else. So we have some friends right now. They're friends of my wife's, and a lot of the men are having to stay behind and fight, or choosing to stay behind and fight, and a lot of them are getting their wives and their kids out of the country. So most of the refugees are women and children. And most of Julia's friends, my wife's friends, do not speak English. So coming to the United States for them might be challenging, even if they could. So they're more likely to stay in Poland, or they're more likely, we have another friend who went to Poland first, and she's now heading for Croatia. Because again, the Serb-Croat language is not that much different from Ukrainian and Russian. And so they're likely to feel more comfortable there. But Europe is, the European Union, I'm in contact with them on a regular basis, just on business reasons. They've been extraordinarily accommodating, and the countries of the European Union are being extraordinarily accommodating, much more so than we've seen from them in the past. And of course, the really scary thing is we really don't know whether any of our friends are ever going to really be able to return to Ukraine, or whether they'll want to return to Ukraine. My wife's family lives in Crimea, and I can tell you they forced everybody to take, if you wanted to keep your apartment, if you wanted to do business, if you wanted to keep your business, you had to get a Russian passport. And if you were, Ukrainian nationalist, very quickly you became very uncomfortable living in Crimea, and you left and went to Ukraine proper. And, I think from my point of view, and Jim and Nancy and others, you probably know better than me, I see a big risk of the same thing happening, that, if Putin is successful in taking over all of Ukraine, you're going to need a Russian passport, and you're going to need to be a Russian citizen to have any life there. And so a lot of our friends may not choose to come back in that kind of an environment. Hopefully it won't work out that way. Hopefully they'll be able to return. But for many of them, I really feel for them, and I wonder what's going to happen to them going forward. And there's no good answer for that right now. So I'll stop there.
You've taken us deep into, Mitch, a question that is here from the congregation. One congregant wrote in that a commentator on the news yesterday said this war is not going to end easily, if it even ends. And it's asking, what do you imagine it taking to bring this war to an end? And I know none of us know, but does anybody have anything more to add? I mean, I think your description of what it looks like in Crimea is very helpful to get down to the ground level of what it means for a Ukrainian nationalist to be in a place where a Russian passport is now expected. Any thoughts from Nancy or Jim about that, or you don't know either, right?
I would say, no, we can't, you don't have a crystal ball. We can't predict the future. But, that said, having served in Latvia, I can tell you that there are plenty of nervous countries wondering if this is even going to end in Ukraine. Moldova is a sitting duck, I would describe it as. It's not a member of NATO. It's not a member of the EU. And there are no security guarantees for a country like Moldova. We know that the Russians are already in Transnistria. The Russian power grab has been going on actually for a very, very long time. I mean, you can start in 2008 with Ossetia, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and Georgia, the 2014 in Crimea. And I think it's pretty clear that Putin does want the entire country of Ukraine. And but other than that, we don't know what's in Putin's mind, and we don't know what it will take to stop him. It's not at all clear.
Russia can definitely defeat Ukraine militarily. Can Russia occupy Ukraine successfully? From what I'm seeing, that's going to be quite a task.
Yeah.
That said, I think that the only way that this entire misadventure is going to be brought to some conclusion is going to have to take place in Moscow. And that is a real complicated and dangerous thing, because you're talking about one man who's surrounded by a phalanx of bodyguards. But I'll tell you, the Russians aren't happy. And when I say the Russians, I mean all the Russians are unhappy. So, including the military. So I kind of put my hopes in Russia. Ukraine can only, they can continue to resist and throw Molotov cocktails at Russian tanks. But Russia, they will, these cities will fall. There'll be death and destruction, and the Russians will raise their flag. I don't know if they plan to incorporate it into the Russian Federation. I think that's Putin's dream. He'd like to restore the former Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. But the solution, I'm afraid, and it saddens me to say, is going to have to be in Russia.
Thank you.
I think Jim is right, and it poses the dilemma that Ukrainians face. Many who have been displaced have moved from the eastern part of the country to the western part, waiting to see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if in fact the entire country is going to be occupied and overrun, and I think that that is what will happen, the question is, do they leave or do they stay? If they leave, there's not a role that they can play except for a very few. If they stay, and of course there's a lot that draws them to stay, because even if the young family leaves, well, mama's family is over here and cousin is over there, and so on. If they stay, then the kind of internal resistance, not just military, which is the way the news tends to report it, but we're not going to lose our country from the inside, not going to lose our soul, our culture, our ability to function within the institutions that we have. There's a long tradition of that in East European countries that underwent 40 some years of communist rule, essentially Soviet indirect rule. And those countries are now our allies. But I can't imagine how difficult it is for people who will ultimately be forced to decide, do I cross this border or not?
Yeah, I agree. We have friends making that decision now. There's a good chance this ends up looking like, Iraq or Afghanistan, where there's a long-term Ukrainian insurgency against the puppet regime that Russia intends to install in Ukraine. And I do agree, the solution to this is in Russia. It really is. And when I talk to my, friends and colleagues in Russia, I have many friends, with the World Bank in Russia. They are, as Jim said, they are not in favor of what's going on here. They're married to Ukrainians. They have relatives in Ukraine. They don't see this. Their brothers, their sisters. They don't. They do not support this operation against Ukraine in any way. Numerous the generals, Putin's generals, urged him not to do this, but he chose to do it anyhow. And really, it's up to the Russians to put a stop to this. I think Jim's and Paul's view of what's likely to happen in Ukraine is right?
I think I better do a time check with Mike and Amy here. Do you want to take another question or two? I want to make sure we have time for the prayer.
Sure, Barbara. I think we're still good to go a few more minutes. There's a lot of questions coming in, and I'm trying to keep track of them. I would say let's keep going, Barbara, with the questions that you have there in front of you.
Excellent, thank you. Nancy, I want to send this to you because Jim's let us know you actually mastered Ukrainian and Russian. So one of the questions is, how are Ukrainian and Russian languages different? And can people from both countries speak both languages? And are they mutually intelligible? So,
well, as Jim mentioned in his presentation, Russians consider Ukrainian to be a substandard version of Russian. It's considered a peasant language. Russians look down on, many Russians look down on Ukrainian. When I told my Russian staff at the US Embassy in Moscow that I was going to be studying Ukrainian for a year, they hooted with laughter. They said they couldn't believe the State Department would train somebody in Ukrainian. So that's the Russian attitude. Yes, they can understand one another, but as Mitchell also pointed out, Ukrainian has a lot of affinity with Polish as well. So the Russians and Ukrainians can understand one another, and the Ukrainians and the Poles can understand one another.
I don't think that's great. Yeah, I actually now finally understand those. Thank you. That was a very good explanation. We've got a question from James Palumbo referring to today's Wall Street Journal with the interview with Robert Service, the op-ed that was on at the, and it's, please discuss if the Clinton administration led the Russians to think the US would not support Ukrainian entry into NATO. Is democracy possible in Ukraine as a non-NATO member? I don't know if you read the interview this morning. I did. Did either of you see it? No. So
I can't get past the paywall with Wall Street Journal, but the fact is, Ukraine was, and Georgia was invited to begin the process for accession to NATO in 2000. It was while I was there.
yeah.
You'd think I'd remember 2008, 2009.
2008 summit declaration said Ukraine will become a member. Yeah.
Yeah. And everyone was very excited. I mean, it's basically said, look, we'd like to have you NATO, but you have to qualify. And by the way, there's been a lot in the news about Ukraine saying, bring us into NATO, bring us into the EU. Well, unlike Soviet structures, there are actually rules for acceding to these things. And the problem with Ukraine, and I hate to say it because we love Ukraine, was that they made pretty slow progress on complying with all of the many requirements to actually accede to NATO. A lot of that was corruption, unfortunately, in the Ministry of Defense. They have made some progress. They've certainly, put up a good show militarily in the current conflict. And I think that hopefully someday may help them. But the fact is, no one suggested that Ukraine was going to be in NATO anytime soon. I've heard people say maybe in 20 years. So it's a long ways off. But it is certainly a desire, and ditto for the EU. It's gonna, I mean, the EU is very busy trying to get them in compliance with all of many rules to get into the EU. But it's all going to take time. I'm unaware of the Clinton administration or any other U.S. administration saying, no, you'll never do NATO. Yeah. That I've not heard, and I don't think that's true. Yeah. I think that the offer is still out there once they qualify.
I think you have to look at the Russian side of the answer to this as well. The Clinton administration was for a reset with Russia. The George W. Bush administration, he looked into Putin's eyes and knew that this was an honest man, and they shared the same soul or some crap like that, pardon the expression. The Obama administration similarly tried to find an avenue to work with a person and a regime essentially that you can't work with. That has to, at the end, become the conclusion in terms of Russia. And of course, in the Trump administration, I don't know how much lower the US could have appeared to the world or been in its actual relationship with Putin and his clique. And honestly, Israelis as well. You know, we've talked about the Israel factor. It would be spectacular if Israel somehow can find a middle way. On the other hand, Israel has not been on the side of the United States over these last couple of weeks in clearly condemning Russian action. And many of those ultra rich Jewish oligarchs made their money in partnership with Vladimir Putin, have Israeli citizenship. They use Israel as a base of operation. And of course, they are generous to many Jewish organizations in Israel and in other places. So yes, of course, Ukraine didn't do the right things with a pace that would have maybe solved some of this problem before it blew up the way it has. On the other hand, we bear some responsibility in that game as well, and Israel bears some responsibility in that game as well.
I agree with you.
Barbara,
Yes.
I'm going to, just as we're looking at the time, it's a few minutes after 8. And I know that one of the things this has been fascinating, by the way, absolutely fascinating. And especially, I was just riveted on Paul's last comment, which was just wild to know that about. But I do want to make sure that we spend a little bit of time on what people in our congregation can do to help.
Thank you.
So the panelists have all given me some places that people can turn to. I've put them on a web page on the Temple website, and I just put the link into the chat. So feel free to click on that link. It'll take you to our Temple website and a host of both resources for donations with agencies that are helping specifically the Jewish population in Ukraine, as well as people helping the general population in Ukraine. One of the things that we do want to stress is, if you do make a donation, it would be great to make a donation to an organization that is funneling all of that money specifically to this crisis and providing humanitarian aid, as opposed to some that are maybe use some of the money for their own administration. So I can't tell you that all of these places on our website are sending it directly to Ukraine. However, we do know that the ones that I listed for the Jewish population, I'm told, are sending all that money to physically help Ukraine. And Paul, it was the Jewish, the first one on the list.
Joint Distribution Committee.
The Joint Distribution Committee has boots on the ground there, and there are a lot of ways. Their website is very detailed in ways you can help. So I encourage us to look at those possibilities.
Thank you so much, Mike. I'd like to give each panelist a chance to make a 30-second concluding thought, offer anything you want the congregation to take home from tonight. For my part, let me just say what an extraordinary panel this has been, and to be part of a congregation that's got this kind of knowledge and depth, it is a remarkable thing. Nancy?
Yeah, I wanted to mention the Jewish community in Russia as well, and the Russian people who are victims here too, because they are dealing with a dictator, and they are going to be suffering severe economic consequences. And what we've seen over the last few days is at least many journalists have been fleeing the country. Many Russian intellectuals, cultural figures have been fleeing the country, going to the Baltics. The Washington Post had a one-page article today on this. And so I think that there's instability everywhere. It isn't just in Ukraine, and there could be, this could spell the end of Putin, not immediately, but eventually. And again, no crystal ball here, but as Russian soldiers go back home in body bags, it's going to have an effect on the population. We saw 4,000 demonstrators in 47 countries today in Russia arrested. And so it's not over yet. So that's my message. This is still very much of a developing situation.
Paul, final thoughts?
Look, I'm just really pleased and touched that so many people have listened to us tonight. It's not always the case that both as Americans and as Jews, the picture is so clear. As Americans, well, we're hoping to sustain a democracy in a country that has rarely had the opportunity to have a democracy, and that's trying. As Jews, this was a cradle of so much Jewishness. The Rebbe, Menachem Schneerson, was from Mykolaiv. You've seen that Mykolaiv has been bombarded, and Avram Goldfaden, who wrote half the Jewish songs that we sing, and was the author of Jewish plays and Jewish Broadway at the beginning of the 20th century, also from Ukraine, and so on and so on. So there's a lot at stake in this, both from an American perspective and a Jewish perspective, and I hope that people stay focused on it and give some help to sustain something that is an experiment in Ukraine, and they really need help.
Thanks, Paul. Jim, you're going to get the last word. I'm going to ask Mitch to go next.
Well, it's been a great discussion. I've really enjoyed listening to all of the panelists and all the experience in the region and the history of the region. To me, again, this just illustrates that everybody kind of wants issues to be black and white, and issues just aren't black and white. And it's really, if you really want to understand an issue, you really have to get into the nuances of it, and you really have to try to understand it from both sides, which can be very, very difficult to do. And it's really hard to understand but there's a mentality in Russia, there's a history in Russia that goes back to World War II, that goes back to Napoleonic invasions, that permeates their thinking and how they look at the situation. The other thing is, it's amazing is, unfortunately, how effective Putin's propaganda campaign is. And there are lots of people in Russia who speak only Russian. They only watch Russian TV. They only listen to Russian radio, and they believe the propaganda, and they believe what they're being told. And unfortunately, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law are two good examples. They live in Crimea, and they're pro-Russian and they're pro-Putin. And we talked about so much of the corruption in Ukraine. Well, my mother-in-law, she looks at Ukraine as, and she looks at what happened in the Yushchenko years and, Timoshenko and everything. She says, if that's democracy, why the hell do I want that? And there's a very big bias in Russian mentality toward, strong leaders and leadership. And that mentality still exists today. And all of that is permeating everything that went there. And Paul alluded very briefly, too, to the role of the West in all of this. And the West has had a role in all of this that needs to be recognized in any broad discussion of the issue of what's going on there today. So
thank you. Last word to you, Jim.
Okay, just some calming words. It's not 1938, it's not 1939. Putin has nukes. That's very concerning. Perhaps I'm in a minority. I don't think he's crazy. I think he's just Putin. He has been very consistent since he took office that he wants to restore either the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. So this shouldn't come as a tremendous surprise. That said, he, even though everyone says he's this great chess player in terms of strategy, he has screwed this up a lot. Russians are angry, all of them, the oligarchs, his inner circle, the military. And everything I know, I learned from Facebook, because we have friends in Ukraine, we have friends in Russia. My friends in Russia, I don't have a lot on Facebook, but the comments to their postings, show me what Russians in Russia are thinking, and without exception, 100% have said things such as, I am ashamed of my country. This man is insane. I am unfriending everyone who supports this war, and on and on and on. They're angry. This shall not stand. And there's going to be it's going to be violent, and it's going to be ugly in Ukraine. But I think the Ukrainians will prevail in a moral sense, and I think ultimately in a physical sense. I don't want people to lose hope. I mean, this is more than just some distant war in Europe. This is Russia. They have nukes. We're all a little afraid. We all live in the Washington area. And I personally think that Putin will either be removed or will have to back down. He's very good at propaganda. He needs an exit ramp because he doesn't like to admit that he's wrong, but I think he'll somehow come up with a story so that he doesn't completely lose credibility and honor, unless, like I say, he's removed. I offer these words as a note of optimism in a very terrible, terrible situation, and our hearts remain with Ukraine.
Perfect closing remarks. Rabbi Sachs is now going to, Rabbi Schwartzman.
I am going to jump in before I hand the microphone to Rabbi Sachs. My job is to express gratitude to everyone here, in particular our speakers. I know I speak for the almost 300 people who are on this program, in incredible gratitude for the learning, the teaching that you've provided us with. And it came so much from the heart. You're inspiring people. We thank you for everything you've done prior to this and for bringing, helping us to be better citizens of the world and members of the Jewish community. Whether we are Jewish or not Jewish, we are members of a shared community that has a vision and a commitment to make the world a better place. And from your words and your insights, we will go forth to do that. I want to thank all of you, Paul and Mitch and Jim and Nancy, and especially you, Barbara, for being our moderator, Cantor Mike Shockett for being our organizer. And I'm going to thank our panelists and let them go off so that Rabbi Jeff Sachs can bring our program, our hearts, our minds into a more spiritual place that we might, end in within our own sort of tradition with a prayer.
Thanks, Amy, and thank you to everybody. Programs like this, really, they bring us closer together as a community. And really, this conversation also, one of the things that all of you panelists did for us is you brought us closer to the people of Ukraine and the people of Russia, and reminded us all that this isn't just a news story. And so, in that vein, following your lead, it's important that we close with our wishes and our prayers for them. I want to share the prayer that we also shared this past Shabbat. Adonai, source of life and love, source of might and fortitude, offer strength to our friends in Ukraine, our new friends, with whom we feel connected through our empathy in their struggle today. We share their love of life. We share their love of democracy and freedom. We share their humanity and we respect their courage. We feel their fear and our hearts are joined with them. God, let our efforts remain focused on their welfare until their lives are no longer in danger. Let our sacrifices for their protection match the need and meet the moment. And may their struggle not be in vain. We pray for their protection. We stand up for their rights. We offer our support to leaders who will act to stop their oppressors. We raise our voices in rebuke and reach our hearts out in love. We unite our own strength with others around the world who would join in the cause of justice, and we pray for safety and peace. Baruch atah Adonai, Magen Avraham upoked Sarah. We praise you, God, shield of Abraham and protector of Sarah. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Jeff, for writing such a beautiful prayer for us. And for all of you who have joined us tonight, just a reminder, here in the chat is where you can click on resources to offer humanitarian and aid to the refugees and to people in Ukraine. And then I got a good sense from the comments tonight that people want to do this more as in the near future. So look for other opportunities to discuss these issues. So thank you all, and we hope you have a great night. Thank you.